All right. Uh, s- so I am going to talk today about the hidden ABCs of product management, so product blind spots. The tricky thing about these blind spots is they can actually sneak up on you. You may not even be aware, and that's part of the reason why I've even put together this talk is to help you identify some of these things and potentially have some tactics and ways to avoid them in the future. But before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I am Wes Galliher. I am the U.S. business lead for ProdPad right now. And in the past, I have been a product manager at a consultancy called Pivotal Labs and was the director of technology for Children's Health here in Dallas, and have also worked at startups in the pharma and biotech space. Long time ago, I was actually a chemistry PhD student at Stanford, so I finished my PhD there. And I'm showing you my disc profile because I believe that a lot of the biases and other things that we bring to decisions and our work lives are really influenced by our personality. So that shows you how I fall in this disc profile assessment on someone that's more cautious and stabilizing or more reserved. But so that's a little bit about me. Please feel free to connect with me on Twitter and LinkedIn or shoot me an email if you have any questions after the talk. So I'm going to paint the picture here first of something that I imagine y'all are very familiar with. You're busy product manager, you have to make a lot of decisions, but you really don't have the ultimate authority. You trust the expertise of your team, and the decisions that you make are impactful. They're going to impact the long-term success of not only your product, but likely the company as well. And one of the ways that I like to describe product managers, that role is decision making as a service, because you're not making the ultimate authority decisions, but you have to make decisions on behalf of all the other functions and areas of the product. But what goes into those decisions that you might not be aware of or that you might not see? So I think there are three major areas: the assumptions that you're making, some biases, and some costs. The things that you're assuming. So the first that we're going to cover is assumptions. So if you look at a definition of an assumption, it's something that you believe to be true based on your experience or information that you have available on hand. But why is that specifically a problem when it comes to decisions? Well, first of all, based on your experience means that it only is extends as far as your own individual experience, and that's why diversity of teams is so important. So you have different experiences represented, you have different perspectives, and you're all going to come in with different biases. So we're big proponents of having a balanced team that is developing products. So you don't develop products that are only for a narrow set of experiences or perspectives. The other thing is the information available on hand. The problem with that is you don't know what you don't know. So it's important to recognize that these assumptions are that themselves. They are assumptions that need to be validated, and you need to collect information that may be beyond what you currently have. So let me talk a little bit about decision making. Based on that information and those assumptions, there's a whole spectrum of ways that people make decisions. On one end of the spectrum is those that make things quickly based on just their intuition. They don't necessarily collect a lot of data or a full set of data. And on the other end of that spectrum is analysis paralysis. I tend to gravitate more towards data given my background, but it's easy to get into a situation where you are paralyzed with not wanting to move forward because you feel like you don't have enough data. And I'm a huge Star Wars fan, so these are well represented by two characters in Star Wars. You're very familiar with Han Solo, was just shoot from the hip, make a quick decision and do it based on his gut. Analysis paralysis would be like C3PO. I just need all of the information and data so I can give you the odds. Now, one of the big factors with making decisions is you need to understand what the type of decision it is. Is it a type 1 or type 2? So Jeff Bezos has talked about these as different, the ability to make a decision that is very reversible, like a type 2 decision, is something that you should just make that much more quickly because it's reversible. You can actually fall back, and this is the value of an agile software development as opposed to maybe longer term hardware manufacturing that take long lead times to make changes. Software can be very reversible. If it's something that's largely irreversible, yes, you want to collect more data and be able to spend a little bit more time making sure that is the right decision, because you won't necessarily be able to undo that. But whenever you're making any decisions, factor in whether it's type 1 or type 2. And the reason that we make assumptions, and we almost need to make assumptions, is so that we can actually fill gaps in our data so that we can move forward. If we waited until everything wasn't an assumption, then we would never be able to move and progress things forward. So you're probably familiar with this Venn diagram, yeah, that the product manager kind of sits between business, UX, and tech. Well, what are the different areas that in each of these areas, what are some assumptions that we make in terms of the common kind of prototypes or artifacts that you have? So in the UX and design side, you have personas, which when you first create them, they're proto personas. It's an assumption of who that persona represents, but it needs to be validated with research with real customers. Same thing with journey maps, or research in general. Research in general is I have an assumption or a hypothesis. I'm going to test and validate that and see what the results are. So that's research. From a technology perspective, you're making an assumption about how tech is going to be used. I would encourage everyone developing a product to consider that there are potential nefarious ways that people might use your product that you didn't expect. So beware that you're assuming that they're going to use it as it was designed by you, but there might be other alternative ways that might get, and not necessarily just poor or bad, like harmful ways, but even just things that you didn't even expect that it was going to get used by it. Walking skeletons, if your development team is wanting to create a quick prototype of what it might look like without actually having to do extensive full-scale development, you might create a walking skeleton, which is an assumption that that is what's necessary for the product. And then integrations. When you're integrating with different tools, those are assumptions you're making about how that information is going to work, how it's going to be transferred back and forth. And on the business side, you may create a business model canvas to validate, especially in the early stages of your company. If you're a startup, you're trying to validate that business model is viable. Willingness to pay, you're making an assumption that the product you're building is of value to an extent that people will be willing to pay for it. That's the only way your business is going to be sustained. And then you're assuming that there is value to potentially different personas and customers. And then lastly is something we do often in the sales realm, which is lead scoring. You're making an assumption that a given type of person who is a lead for your business that might eventually convert to a customer has a given score that will then mean their propensity to buy is higher. So that's an assumption that you have to refine and iterate as you go along. So those are big assumptions that we're making in product development. Now let's shift and talk about biases. So we bring a lot of different natural and personal biases to our decisions and our product, and those naturally produce blind spots that will mean that we'll miss things. So we perceive value in one way, and you can see here is like the rose-colored magnifying glass. So we're seeing it from one perspective, but we have to have empathy for our customers, for our users, for our colleagues about the different perceptions that they have. So it's not only important to identify our own biases, but also to identify the ways and perspectives that others might be viewing it. Now, it's by no means exhaustive, but here's a set of 5 kind of common biases that we see in product development. Anchoring bias. Now, this is something that numbers actually do influence people, whether they're accurate or not. Dan Ariely has a book called Predictably Irrational, where he talks a lot about anchoring bias with prices, where you may have 3 different plans that you have your product is priced at if you're a SaaS company, and you might significantly show a much higher price on the highest, most expensive plan to sort of bias people to say, oh, this middle tier plan is actually relatively cheap relative to the most expensive one. And so you might be able to price that higher than you would without that anchoring value for the highest price plan. So that's one example. Confirmation bias. This is the bias that we tend to look for confirmation of our own perceptions of value and what we are what we perceive to be a benefit. So these end up becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. So that's something we should always be aware of, that we're going to look for in data things that confirm our own opinions. Hindsight bias is that once we know something, we can't unremember it or remember that we never knew it in the first place. And so this really challenges our ability to learn from past failures. The status quo bias is something that you probably have heard before, that people feel regret from negative outcomes resulting from them actually taking action. They regret that. They feel more regret doing that than they do if there's a negative outcome of them just being inactive and staying the same. So they would prefer to be to not take action and not have any as big of negative outcomes. We see this often in the sales world, where you're talking to customers, and the biggest competitor to, I would believe, almost any product is actually status quo. So if you're trying to sell your product to someone, an organization, it's likely you're losing deals to status quo more than you're actually getting people to convert. There is a momentum that has to be overcome in order to actually switch, and there's barriers from a individual standpoint, but as well as organizational standpoint, to switch to your product. And then lastly is commitment escalation. So this is where you make decisions and commit resources, feeling like that's going to guarantee more of a reward, but you just escalate it because you have already invested these resources and costs into it. So each of these biases mean that you're missing something, right? So if I talk about anchoring bias, the things you're going to miss are the way that numbers are affecting your decisions. So be aware that any numbers that are presented, and this goes for statistics as well, will be potential ways that your decisions might be biased and influenced. Confirmation bias. Now, if we do this, then we're going to be seeking information that disproves our initial assumptions. So as personally, and some things that I encourage teams to do is actually celebrate things that invalidate your assumption. Because that actually means that you've actually avoided this confirmation bias. So look for ways to actually invalidate things that you believe to be true. Also, think about bringing in people that you know have diverse perspectives, not necessarily just your big advocates. If you're talking to customers, talk to the people that are that really don't like or have a negative experience with what you're providing, to better learn what problem they're trying to solve or other things, to avoid this bias. Hindsight bias, if you don't overcome this, you will miss the opportunity to learn from past failures. So Barry O'Reilly has a great book called Unlearn, which is really the core premise is that the things that you've done now up to this point to get you where you are unlikely to get you to the next level. So you actually have to unlearn the way that you've always done it, so that you can actually learn what is most appropriate. And this is really, really very relevant in this post-COVID world, because the values and the context by which people are using your products has shifted so much for many products, that you need to unlearn the way that you have done things so far. So avoid that hindsight bias. Now, the status quo bias will miss potential outcomes that are offered by taking new actions. It's obviously, it can be very difficult to get a large enterprise to commit to moving, but look for small ways and small kind of quick wins to take, where you can actually move, take a new action and see that there might be an incredible value there. If you think about the innovation in Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, which is about these large organizations struggle to address markets that might be tangential to their existing customer base, because they're so focused on providing value to their existing customers. So, but you might miss a huge potential market if you don't consider moving away from your status quo. And then lastly, if we have a commitment escalation bias, we miss opportunities to avoid more costs or problems by just continuing to commit to a path that we might have identified or uncovered reasons why it's not the best path forward. So make sure that just because you have committed resources and time towards something doesn't mean that it would be the best path. The best course of action should be to kill that project or to put it on hold. You know, we often think about this at ProdPad with some ideas that there might be an idea that you've started working on, but if it shows that is potentially not going to provide the value you assumed, then put it on pause, and then or maybe consider it will come up again if it's still a significant need, or there might be a related need that you could just tweak the idea or the solution a little bit and then provide significantly more value. So that's assumptions and biases. The cost. This is something that I think we tend to, as product people, we're always asked to estimate costs. You know, whether that's cost of development, whether that's cost of the just the holistic part of launching a product or a new feature. But what are some of the things that we might not consider when we're thinking about costs? So complexity costs. So Chris Gale used to be the VP of engineering at Yammer, and he's quoted as saying that it's the debt you accrue by complicating features or technology in order to solve problems. So it's very easy to get to a spaghetti code product where you're just continuing to add functionality because you say some customer asked for this. I need to close this deal by giving them this feature, so let's just add it on because it's not that difficult. Well, you've probably heard this many times over. Can't you just add blah, 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 whether it's a toggle, some sort of a feature or something else to the product that is like, it's not technically that complex, right? It's just a toggle, it's it's a few lines of code just to say have an on or an off switch, right? It has two states. It's either on or it's off. It's a Boolean operator. Well, the problem is you're actually supporting four potential combinations of those states with that toggle. And then what happens if you we'll just add another toggle from a UI and the lines of code, it's just incrementing it by one. But suddenly now there are 8 potential states. And so you can imagine if you take this to fruition, you're adding, 4 different kind of toggles or things that are in your product, things you can turn off or settings you can configure. Now you suddenly have to support 16 potential states. So if you're starting to hear or you're asking yourself, well, how hard would it be? And this is a common question that engineers get asked. Well, how hard is it to actually build this into my product, into the code base? Well, it's not actually that hard, but think about the future refactoring to support a product or the quality and to find and uncover bugs in a product that has increasing complexity. So instead of asking how hard would it be to add this, then start asking how much more complex or complicated does it get with this additional toggle, and that's actually shifting the discussion to a more important one. And this goes for the product people, but also encouraging stakeholders. So whenever you get asked that question, how hard would it be? Start to say, well, this might increase our complexity this way, our ability to support, our ability to address bugs and other things like that. Another cost that we need to factor into decisions is the cost of delay. So humans are actually very poor at being able to differentiate between urgency and value. Cost of delay is actually something that combines both of them. So in order to make effective decisions, you have to understand that there's a sense of urgency of when something needs to be done, but also the value that doing that is going to provide and the trade-offs you're making by doing one thing instead of another. This is why the best practice in product is to prioritize one to end, right? Everything cannot be the highest priority because then nothing's a priority. So prioritize top to bottom and understand what are the impacts of doing one feature versus another. So costs in this sense can actually be monetary costs. That could be strategic costs. If you do something now, how is that going to impact your company or your strategy in the future? It can be competitive. Are you going to do something that is a competitor the competitor feature, but do you know whether the competitors' customers, which are probably your customers as well, are using them, or is this going to impact your customer value? The perception that your customers have of the value of your product and other things. So the concept here that's shown is if feature A is done first, you have this high cost of or relatively low cost of delay. So it takes you a little bit less time to do A than to do C, which is on the right side. But what that means is that by doing A, you can finish that more quickly, get a lot of value on the y-axis, and then move to B, and then start on C. So it might take you the same amount of time to get A, B, and C done, but you're getting a lot more incremental value by doing A first. So one of the things I will say here is prioritize not based on the feature or the idea you have, but prioritize based on the value of solving that problem. This is why customer-driven product development is so important. You need to have a problem. You need to understand the problem that you're addressing. How valuable is it if you can solve that problem? So one of my favorite quotes that I've heard recently is, "A perfectly grilled steak is of no use to a vegetarian." The vegetarian doesn't have a problem with how well you've grilled your steak or how seasoned it is or the cut, but so you need to make sure that for your core customer base or your persona you're solving for, solve the right problem, and then develop and solve that in the best possible way. And then the lower value problems, you might still solve them, but don't invest as much effort and resources in solving them in the perfect way. Make sure you address the right ones. Lastly is the tech debt cost. So everything you need to consider is, okay, well maybe we won't fix this right now. We'll just accumulate this tech debt. But you need to understand the decisions that you're making today. What is that going to do in the future when it comes to being able to support your product and to be able to have something that is not going to weigh down those trade-offs and decisions your development team has to make in the future about what kind of features or add-on incremental value work they're going to be focused on if they are building up a lot of this tech debt that they're going to have to pay down later. So there's a lot of different types of debt, and I encourage Jana Bastow from PDO from ProdPad has a lot of great information around the different types of debt. She's got talks out there. So, what is the risks to you and your organization if you ignore these hidden blind spots? Right, the assumptions. If you ignore your assumptions, you're going to miss out on capturing potential value. You will build the wrong thing. Your assumptions being incorrect will then mean you'll build something that won't get used at all, or it might get misused in a way that you didn't anticipate and that ultimately doesn't provide your business value. If you ignore biases, you're going to limit your ability to learn. So you're going to learn only the things that you know or have recognized, and not expand that to things that you have that you could potentially learn. You won't break out of the status quo. You will do things just the way you've always done it, and ultimately, another competitor or a startup or someone is going to come and do things differently that will suddenly gain value. You'll become the Blockbuster versus Netflix. Narrow, and you will also have a very narrow focus. So team diversity is so important here, and being aware of these natural and inherent biases. If you ignore cost assumptions, then you're going to build in some unnecessary complexity. You're going to accumulate debt of many kinds, and likely down the line, you're going to experience quality issues that you will have to resolve in the future. So that was a lot about identifying them, a little bit about understanding what to do, but here's some tips and tricks that I have based on my experience for best practices to avoid these. So they come into 4 different categories: discovery, tracking them, communicating them, and I would say hiring as well. So do continuous discovery. Um, why? Because you really don't know what you don't know. So that you see they're known and unknown kind of matrix up there. Your known knowns. Just make sure that you fact check those things. You're verifying them. You've got supporting data. If you know that you have some unknowns, go collect some data on it, and do a little bit of exploration for things that you don't know. And then also, you already have some intuitive perceptions of the market, of your customer base, of what you need to do, and those would fall under your unknown knowns. So collect data to validate what you know that you don't know, and then involve the entire team in discovery. Marty Kagan's big about talking about how you are missing out on 50% of the potential of your developers if you're only having them code. If you think about it, some of the best, most creative problem solvers are actually your engineers, because they understand the complexities and nuances of the technical product that you have, the architecture, but they also understand what's technically possible, right? As a product person, you may not be technical, and I personally believe you don't have to be deeply technical, but you need to be able to rely on the expertise of your team to provide innovative and creative solutions to a problem. Don't rely on your customers to tell you the right solution. So many teams just are or become order takers from their customers, and their customer says, "I need X." Well, understand the nuances, and design thinking will show you like the five whys or ways to uncover the underlying reasons for why they're asking you for X. And then you can get really creative about potential solutions that might even be lower effort, but incredibly more valuable at solving that problem. So you give them why and you solve that problem better than they even knew how. So involve the entire team. That's the trio, the product, design, engineering. And then also I would actually even consider involving some of the other functions in the group. So customer success and support. They need to understand the challenges your customers are experiencing. And I've even brought legal and compliance to talk to customers, because it's easy for them to document all the things that they need to say no to because of legal and compliance reasons. That makes sense, but they don't understand the nuances or the context behind it. So even giving them a visibility into the customer research that's going on is important, whether that's communicated asynchronously or even live as part of discovery research. Track your assumptions. So our brain is a terrible office, right? Or a office cabinet. We cannot store everything. And especially now in the COVID world where we have to work so asynchronously or remotely, make sure that you're documenting these assumptions and track them, especially the stages that they're in. So understand that you have some early assumptions that are need to be validated. They're in your discovery column, and really any kind of a Kanban style where you've got a column for discovery, you've got a column for things that are need to be validated, and you've got things that maybe have been invalidated. And I would say don't just document assumptions that are, say, technical assumptions, but also design, product, and business assumptions. Like I mentioned earlier, there's many facets across UX design and or tech and product that are involve assumptions. So document them and mention, like, this becomes your backlog of research or validation that needs to happen. And then revisit the assumptions regularly. So often personas or business model canvases or other artifacts are created, and then they are put up on the wall, they are dropped into Google Drive, and they are forgotten about, and they're put in a PowerPoint slide, and becomes our persona. Well, those things are going to change, and your customer's experience and context is going to change. So you should be revisiting your assumptions and see how those are things that might need to be updated, based on new information. Communicate. As an organization, transparency is king. It needs to be something that everyone can be aware of, can contribute to, can ideate on, can understand, like, and add their perspective, right? So that's where you can expand your access to a diverse set of perspectives. So be transparent and explicit about the assumptions that you have, especially when you're making and communicating decisions. So when someone asks you to present your roadmap, there's a lot of assumptions that, especially as that gets further from today or from now, there are things that you're making that, and you need to be able to be transparent with the assumptions that are inherent in it, or say these things need to be validated, or we have good information to support the reasons why we're doing these things currently. Communicate the trade-offs. An executive that says, well, we need to do this, and they says, here's the sticky note that we need to build this feature. Well, I'm not saying you don't necessarily listen to that. Take that feature and say, well, okay, we're doing A, B, and C. If you want to do this before B, then suddenly we won't be able to do C in this time frame. So communicate those trade-offs, and then talk about the complexity costs, the tech debt that it might inherit, and other things like that. Lastly, hire. When you're hiring for a product team, don't hire for culture fit. It's easy to look to interview someone and to talk and to see how they might fit in with the team, and it's almost like a confirmation bias. You're looking for people that are similar to yourselves, but that actually can be detrimental to not only your team but to the product. Hire for culture add. Look for gaps that you have in your team, that whether it's a diversity, it's a different perspective, it's like build up a team that has a diverse representation. And then when you're interviewing, make sure that there's a diverse panel of interviewers so that the candidate is talking to lots of different people that have different perspectives, not just 5 product people that are similar, but have a diversity of the interview panel as well. That is it. Happy to answer any questions. Feel free to screenshot this or other things. I've got some of the slides up here, as well as some things that I've talked. I have an article around the art and science of decision making. Feel free to connect with me, and I would love to connect with you afterwards. I think, Adam, back to you.
Sorry about that. Was muted. Thank you, Wes. Awesome talk. We do have some questions. And the good news is you kind of just taught us how to do this well, and it's not much to really consume. It's easy. We can go back and just be amazing product managers. Just get the right people and do the right things. It's not even that complex. But I like the very first question from Michelle. It's like it's always I'm the kind of person. It's like, oh, it's amazing thought, and it's like, well, how do I execute it? And if you can see in the Q&A, she's kind of just talking about. She was asking if you have any practical examples of how you work with the team to really kind of uncover bias. And I think that's such an interesting question. Do you have thoughts
Yeah. So we've actually done. So we've actually done like an assumption mapping exercise where we will go through our product and start to, or maybe it's an artifact that you've created, and you say, okay, what assumptions might we be making about this? So that's one way of kind of uncovering assumptions. But I think Michelle is asking more about biases within the product team. Now that is where I think you look at just analyze like the diversity of perspectives that your team has. So, understand what their backgrounds are, where they're coming from. Look to other kind of cross-functional teams within the organization and how you interact. It's more difficult to understand that, but if you have a list of potential biases, you can start with that and say, like, where are areas where we started unlearning the way we've always done things? Are we looking for diverse perspectives when we're doing our research? One of the other things that I've suggested to teams is actually, if you have a disagreement in the team, have the team members argue the opposite perspective. So if I believe one thing to be true and I'm arguing with somebody about that the opposite is true, then I need to actually learn to defend that. So it gives me empathy for that other perspective. So that'll actually reduce, I guess, some of that bias and perspective that I bring by having to argue the other side. But it's tough to uncover the biases as a team unless you already have identified some of them.
Yeah, sure. Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, so that next question from Antoinette. Anytime you're working with upper management, that's always fun, and trying to convince them that you should or should not do something. And I was trying to think about this as well. I'm sure a lot of us somewhat think alike, but that's a challenge that I personally have or have run into. Just dealing with upper management, like. Any particular way you slice that pizza or approach you take with that group of stakeholders?
Yeah, it's probably one of the bigger challenges that product people experience, right? Is that the executives or stakeholder upper management are saying something, you need to do something, right? They're the ones that are off like paying your salaries and other things. But the best recommendation I can make for convincing and influencing stakeholders is to use customer data and research. So I used to, back at Pivotal, I used to actually record research interviews with customers, with their permission, of course, but then take video clips of them evaluating prototypes or using our product, and then play those back for the stakeholders to say, like, this prototype, so maybe you haven't actually investigated, built out the full product or experience, but when they're testing your prototype and they're not seeing the value and they're verbalizing like that doesn't make any sense to me, suddenly the stakeholder or upper management is not necessarily hearing you say there's no value here. They're hearing it directly from the customers to say there's no value. Or if you have quantitative data from customers about usage stat, like all the features that might get used, like build that story of why not necessarily only the story of why, but also the story of why not.
Yeah, definitely, and kind of showing, I don't know, there's just that human element where when I see it or hear it myself, I can kind of just process it internally better than than when someone's just telling me to take their word for it or things like that.
Yeah, I mean and also
Yeah.
you can paint the picture of if we continue down this path, what is that likely going to result in if they don't use this? So if we invest, $500,000 to develop these features and we launch them and they don't get used, and we've projected those features to be 5 million in revenue, then we've lost out not only on that 500,000, but we've lost out on the potential revenue. So it's more important to kind of show what the impact will be if you don't actually achieve the things that you're expecting them to do. So we had my former manager used to tell a story about how they built a product or a feature into their product, and 6 months later, they recognized there was a bug that it actually never worked, but no customer ever reported that it didn't work, but it had been broken ever since they launched it. So that was wasted effort because that was good evidence it never got used.
Right. Yeah. Interesting scenario there. Okay. Well, I'm not sure that we talked about what we would do with questions that we maybe can't get to. I think the next set of sessions, it starts at 12:10. We've got probably a minute and a half. Do we want to take a stab at the last question?
So it looks like we got a couple of questions. We got two. So
Yeah.
Nitu, how do you sell fruit trees, which take years to produce, when everyone just sees veggies, which takes a few months to deliver, as the best ROI, when the truth is that market needs both fruits and vegetables? That's a very interesting question. So this is again a little bit of that cost of delay, where you might have you need to be able to address some of that, the low hanging fruit, I guess, to continue the analogy, but then be able to say like we can do this as a quick win, and that's where kind of like that low effort and potentially high value. If you can identify those first, and then understand that you're going to have to balance that with longer term efforts that will pay off dividends in the future. It's kind of like you have to juggle in a given sprint or cycle, whatever. You've got a little bit of probably some tech debt. You've got some like early value add quick wins, but then you may have some foundational things that need to be built for the long term. So it's always going to be a little bit of a balance and trade-off, and that will some sprints you will do more of one over the other. But that's, I think, the important thing to consider across that. Lastly, I'll address Pete's question about, so how do you synchronize with your culture ad when biases are so deeply rooted at times? So in other words, how do you identify cultural gaps that will come as complementary?
Yeah.
So deeply rooted biases obviously are going to be very difficult to unroot. And I would be very upfront when hiring or when interviewing candidates. So look for that. But be very, also two things: be very transparent with the organization or the interviewing panel that we are trying to fill a gap here, or we are trying to add to our culture that might be opposed to some of the deeply rooted biases. So that's one, you've identified it and you're addressing it. The second thing is also be transparent with the person that you're hiring so that they don't join the company and then get so dissatisfied and discontent and frustrated that there's this deep-rooted bias that opposes their perspective, that then they leave, because that's not going to be beneficial to either the candidate or your organization. So I think transparency and identifying that. There are going to be some toxic cultures that have deep-rooted biases that you won't be able to overcome. In some of those cases, we've actually in the past, I've actually recommended people leave. That unfortunately, there are some stubborn kind of cultures that the biases are going to be there, and you can't. I would continue to use an argument that it's called rational drowning, where you say, if you continue to act in this way, here are the results that is going to happen and using data that you can find that shows, like, when people have done this the way they're always doing it, then it's going to result in negative consequences. And so for those people that are stubborn in their ways, if you can influence them in a way that you, with data, support that if they continue that, it's going to result in negative consequences, that might soften them a bit so they can change. But if they're unwilling to change and unwilling to unlearn, they're going to stagnate and potentially just end up in that pit of despair.
That was an amazing answer. These are some tough questions. Thank you. Well, okay. It looks like I think the next set of sessions start in about 8 minutes. So everyone, if you need to take a bathroom break or grab a snack, grab something to drink, you'd exit this session and then go into the main event space and just be ready to access the next one. But Wes, thank you so much. Very informative. Always love to hear you speak. I've got to follow you more often, just so I can learn from you. Thank you very much.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Okay. Bye, everyone.